Hi everyone, my name is Isabella Turner. The international conflict that I am choosing to talk about is the Syrian Civil War. So first I'm going to get into a little bit of background, where it all began. It started with protests. So some teenagers had been arrested for painting revolutionary slogans on a school wall in 2011. Some of these read things like "The people want to topple the regime." And it started a lot of conflict, and citizens protested, demanding government reforms and democracy. They were not happy with how the Syrian government was handling things with those teenagers' arrests. And during a protest, security forces opened fire on citizens of Syria, and it killed dozens. Now, this then triggered demands for the Syrian dictator Bashar al Assad's resignation. And then, over time, it escalated to a civil war. Now, a civil war is a self contained war within a country, typically for control. And the United Nations officially declared Syria in a state of civil war on June 12th, 2012. Now, the dynamics of this war that we're going to get in depth into in just a little bit here, sort of the key players, the people involved. There's the rebels versus the supporters, the Shia Alawite versus the Sunni majority, also ISIS, which leads to territory disputes, and also a proxy war. So, some levels of analysis in conflict, how this relates to what we've been learning about lately. Levels of analysis, two key levels here are individual and domestic. Now, individual analysis is seen through citizen participation. That's in protests, rebelling, the loyalists' support for Assad. There's a side to everything in this war. Citizens have been participating since the very beginning. And also, Bashar al-Assad, he's individual analysis just because he's a kind of crazy leader. His tendencies and his personalities all make him who he is as a leader. And then domestic, that's seen through dictatorship, democratic versus authoritarian governments, and also Syrian opposition groups. Dictatorship is obvious because Syrian government is a dictatorship. Bashar al-Assad is a dictator. He has complete power over Syria. Then there's democratic versus authoritarian governments. Protesters were pro-democracy and loyalists are pro-dictatorship, so you can see how conflict arose there. And then also Syrian opposition groups such as the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian National Council. The Free Syrian Army is composed of a group of soldiers that have denied firing on protesters and have even left their posts in the midst of a fight to sort of protest. And then the Syrian National Council is a combination of groups who all have the same goal, which is to take down Assad. So these groups have really joined together to speak their word and prove their point, and that is shown on a domestic level of analysis. Now, the different types of conflict that are apparent in this war. There's ideological, governmental, terrorism, and also territorial conflicts. So ideological, that comes into play through the religious groups. Now, there's two main branches of Islam in this war. There's the Sunni and the Shia Alawite Muslims. Now, the Sunnis are the majority, and they have banded behind the rebels. Now, the Shia Alawites are helping Assad hang on to his regime. They are loyalists to Assad. So these opposing views have brought sectarian conflict into the war, and many people believe that these disputes could, over time, lead to genocide. Governmental conflict comes into play when looking at the supporters and opponents of al-Assad. There's two different views here. Some people love him, some people hate him. That's obviously going to cause conflict. Terrorism is a sort of unconventional conflict, and that is seen through ISIS, whose aim is to impose strict Islamic ideology on Syrians in the areas it controls. Now, at the beginning of the civil war, ISIS was seizing many Syrian territories, and this kind of gets into the territorial conflict aspect. And now, towards the end of the war, maybe not the end, but more so like the calm period, many of the territory ISIS once claimed has been recaptured by Syria, which is aiding in the takedown. So this sort of shows the rise and fall of ISIS over the years. And ISIS has carried out many terrorist attacks within Syria involving chemical warfare, which we'll get into in just a minute. The proxy war, allies and enemies. So Russia and Iran both have the same views here. They are loyalists to Assad. Their aim is to keep Assad in power. And through this, they oppose all rebel groups and have shown that they oppose all rebel groups. In 2015, Russia launched air campaigns against Assad's opponents, including citizens of Syria that are rebels. And then the United States has a different view than Russia and Iran. Their aim is to remove Assad from power. And they have also provided arms and training to rebels, but there is sort of a contradiction here because the U.S. does not want Assad in power, but the U.S. is fighting ISIS, which is one of the strongest anti-Assad forces. So you can see how that contradiction comes into play. The U.S. has intervened in the war and actually caused Assad to agree to the removal and destruction of Syria's chemical weapons arsenal after they attacked their own people using chemical warfare. And also, U.S.-led coalition launched airstrikes inside Syria in an effort to destroy ISIS. So the United States has played a pretty major role in this civil war. Next, weapons of mass destruction, particularly chemical warfare. Nuclear and biological warfare don't play as big of a role. Syria doesn't employ those as much, but definitely chemical warfare. In 2013, sarin-filled rockets fired at suburbs of Damascus, killing over 1,000 people. Now, the government blamed rebel forces for this attack, but it has been proven that really these actions could have only been carried out by Syria's government. And this is where that U.S. intervention came into play. Former President Barack Obama at the time was president, honestly said there was a red line there and they crossed it. So he urged them to remove and destroy all chemical warfare. And it also precipitated Syria's entry into the Chemical Weapons Convention. But the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has documented Syria's continued use with chemical warfare, even though they have declared that all stockpiles had been destroyed. ISIS has also been accused of using chemical warfare, homemade even, in a 2015 attack in Maria, which did kill a baby. Lastly, we're going to talk about peace attempts really quick. There's been a couple different peace talks over the years. In 2012, the United Nations called for a ceasefire plan. This was called the Geneva Communique, but the plan never got off the ground. A few years later, in 2014, there was a peace talk between Syrian government and world powers called Geneva II, and this also ended without a solution. 2 years after that, in 2016, diplomats from more than a dozen countries agreed to a cessation of hostilities or a temporary halt in fighting, but once again, this partial truce did not take hold, which is why the war is still going on. So here's a quick look at my sources. Thank you guys for listening.